Edgar Cayce predicted 2026, and you won't believe what happens next. Say that slowly, and then look up from the headlines. It's December 2025, the year that has been building like distant thunder. Satellites paint the oceans in shifting blues. Weather models light up like a fever chart. There's a persistent buzz in the background, an uneasy hum that people describe as a sense that something is changing inside the world and inside themselves. Do you feel it? We do. And when the noise settles, a map begins to emerge. An old map, a psychic map, drawn in the language of visions and symbols by a man known as the Sleeping Prophet, Edgar Cayce. According to Cayce, the calendar turns toward a watershed in 2026. What follows is not a certainty, but a sequence of probabilities, patterns, and warnings that, taken together, create a picture of what may unfold. Stay with us. If this intrigues you, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series. Before we walk that map, we have to answer the obvious question: why trust Edgar Cayce at all? The quick answer is historical performance. In the early 20th century, Cayce gave thousands of trance readings while in a somnambulistic state, addressing health, lost civilizations, and future events. Some of his statements were later pointed to as prescient. He spoke of economic upheaval in the late 1920s, of global conflict fractures that align with later wars, of archaeological discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls being found, and of technologies and social shifts that echo later developments in medicine and energy. None of this is a license to treat his words as modern scientific forecasting. Instead, they function as a set of data points in a larger metaphysical framework, signposts that invite examination. We are not here to declare scientific fact. We are here to follow a line of prophetic thought, to weigh its internal consistency, and to ask what it suggests for the coming months. Edgar Cayce's voice operates through a distinct interpretive lens. To read Cayce is to enter three guiding principles that recur throughout his archive and that serve as keys to decoding the map he offers us now. First, the Earth as a living being. In Cayce's framework, the planet is not inert. It responds to imbalances, toxins, and spiritual conditions with processes that are part purge, part rebirth. Think of it as an organism working toward homeostasis. When systems become overloaded, whether ecological, social, or moral, the body of the planet may react in ways that can be dramatic, remapping coastlines or adjusting climate patterns as part of a larger rebalancing. Second, national karma. Cayce discussed the idea that nations accrue consequences for collective choices, and that these karmic debts can manifest in geopolitical reordering or physical upheaval. This is not a sermon of blame, but a caution that collective behavior has consequences that can play out at macro scales. Third, the return of Atlantean influences. Cayce often referenced a past civilization, Atlantis, whose technologies and energies, lost and later resurfacing, can re-emerge in modern times through people, artifacts, or energetic patterns. He framed this return as a double-edged sword. The knowledge and power of ancient cultures can be used to heal or to harm, depending on the consciousness that wields them. These three principles are the interpretive gears through which Cayce's geographical warnings turn. When we say map of probability, we mean that Cayce's readings do not hand us a deterministic roadmap stamped with dates and coordinates like a GPS. Rather, they present zones of increased likelihood, areas where the interplay of Earth's living response, national karmic patterns, and reactivated ancient energies creates a higher probability of significant change. In the coming minutes, we will trace that map, piece by piece. The Pacific Rim and West Coast, the Eastern Seaboard and Atlantic Edge, polar and subpolar dynamics, interior North America as a possible refuge, and an unexpected spiritual role for Russia. Where the readings provide specific anchors, we will name them. Most prominently, the reading often cited in relation to the West Coast rupture, as noted in reading 3976-15, and the passages that point to Russia's future role, as cited in reading 3976-29. We will keep our language cautious, Cayce suggests, Cayce implies, and in his metaphysical vocabulary, Cayce describes. Start on the Pacific side. For decades, Cayce's readings have been interpreted to warn of a major shift along the Pacific Rim, a rupture that could alter coastlines and awaken long-dormant volcanic systems. In reading 3976-15, Cayce speaks in imagery that readers and researchers have long linked to the idea of a breaking or separation somewhere in the Western Ocean margins. He couches it in symbolic language, as was his custom, but the implication many draw is of tectonic reconfiguration that could involve parts of California and the broader Pacific Arc. Importantly, Cayce frames this within a spiritual and energetic context. This is not framed as random geological happenstance, but as part of a planetary purification connected to human activity and ancient influences resurfacing. Translate that into contemporary language, and you get a picture of the West Coast as an area where seismic activity could be concentrated and where coastal inundation remains a plausible risk if multiple factors converge. But rupture need not mean immediate catastrophic collapse of an entire coastline in a single moment. Cayce's language allows for sequences, eruptions, earthquakes, subsidence events that could cumulatively redraw the map over months or years rather than hours. That distinction matters. When you hear the phrase West Coast rupture, imagine a high-probability stress point that could produce both acute episodes and longer-term coastal change. Scientists debate timescales and mechanisms. Models vary. Cayce's reading adds a metaphysical layer to that debate rather than a technical alternative. The takeaway is precautionary awareness, not wholesale panic. Flip the globe to the Atlantic side. Cayce's material contains references to abrupt changes along eastern coasts and shifts in sea patterns that could affect regions like New York and northern Europe. Here, the imagery is of sudden sea displacement, rapid movement of water or changes in coastlines that would demand immediate adaptation. Again, these are framed as probabilities within Cayce's vision. The combination of polar instability, shifting ocean currents, and localized geological responses could translate, in Cayce's logic, into surprise events along the Atlantic margins. That idea is not a certified scientific claim. It is a prophetic hypothesis couched in metaphysical language, and it invites planners and communities to consider contingencies rather than assume continuity. The poles themselves are central to this map. Cayce spoke of disturbances in the Arctic and Antarctic, changes that, in his readings, reflect larger redistributions of the planet's energetic and physical balances. Modern scientists chart sea ice loss, permafrost thaw, and shifting circulation patterns that affect weather and sea levels. Cayce's readings add a spiritual dimension, suggesting that polar shifts could trigger reallocation of seas, new volcanic activity under ice, and a rearrangement of what we consider stable geography. Polar, in Cayce's vocabulary, is not a single event. It is a process that interacts with human choices and ancient energies. We must remember that the scientific community debates the mechanics of pole-related changes and that Cayce's statements function as a metaphysical overlay. Yet taken together, the polar warnings in Cayce's map point to a period of accelerated change in which long-standing assumptions about coastline and climate may be tested. That leads us to a surprising feature of Cayce's map: pockets of relative stability, places that, in his readings, appear favorable for reconstruction and renewal. Across several readings and commentaries, interior North America, parts of the Midwest, and certain regions of southern Canada are depicted as zones of comparative steadiness, areas sitting on older cratonic foundations, with less exposure to immediate coastal upheaval. Names like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and regions of southern Canada are frequently cited by interpreters of Cayce as part of an inland band where life might continue and where new social and infrastructural life could be rebuilt. It is critical to interpret this as a probabilistic placement of relative resilience, not a guarantee of immunity. No place is wholly safe in a world of large-scale change. Still, if Cayce's map is read as a guide, these interior zones become logical candidates for communities that prioritize cooperation, sustainable agriculture, and local infrastructures less dependent on coastal supply chains. And then there is Russia, often a controversial note to readers unfamiliar with Cayce's spiritual lexicon. In certain readings, and as referenced in reading 3976-29, Cayce suggests a role for Russia that is spiritual more than strictly political. He frames it as a nation that may be called upon in future cycles to offer leadership in a new moral and spiritual order, an emergence not merely of military or economic power, but of a cultural and spiritual influence that contributes to healing global divides. This is not a geopolitical endorsement. Cayce's emphasis is on transformation, on the possibility that a nation historically associated in modern times with certain geopolitical tensions could become a conduit of new wisdom or reconciliation. Interpretations vary widely, and we must avoid reading this as a deterministic political forecast. Instead, view it as a symbolic counterpoint inside Cayce's larger tapestry. National karma can invert into national contribution, depending on the choices those nations make. Running through all of these geographic strands is a central behavioral prescription from Cayce. Survival is less about concrete fortifications and more about frequency and vibration. He famously taught that spirit is life, the mind is the builder, the physical is the result. What does that mean in practice? For Cayce, the mode of being, the frequency at which a person or community vibrates, attracts certain outcomes. Fear, panic, and scarcity consciousness, he suggested, magnetize danger and dislocation. Compassion, clarity, and service orient people toward protection, guidance, and synchronicity. This is not a metaphysical get-out-of-risk card that guarantees exemption from harm. It is a behavioral framework that shifts attention away from pure hoarding and bunker mentality toward communal resilience, mental discipline, service-oriented action, and the cultivation of relationships and skills that make coordinated responses possible. When we translate Cayce's frequency concept for a 21st century audience, it becomes practical in several low-risk ways. First, cultivate community. People who have strong local ties, reciprocal arrangements, and shared plans are more adaptable than isolated individuals. Second, basic preparedness, not panic-driven stockpiling, but foundational planning that includes water, communication strategies, and knowing where to turn in your neighborhood, serves as sensible stewardship. Third, practice mental and emotional resilience. Skills like stress management, clear decision-making under pressure, and fostering compassion in crisis can alter outcomes in measurable ways. Fourth, commit to service. Volunteering, helping neighbors, and participating in local networks not only meets immediate needs, but also raises the collective frequency Cayce emphasized. All of these measures are low-cost, non-alarmist, and do not require drastic abandonment of life as you know it. They lean into stability rather than flight. The map also carries a metaphysical overlay that must be acknowledged: the return of Atlantean influences. Cayce spoke of souls and technologies that traveled across cycles of time, accruing patterns and potentials that can surface in modernity. Interpreting this literally is tempting for those drawn to esotericism. Artifacts, lost technologies, or energetic patterns from an ancient civilization that once spanned oceans might be re-emerging now. Interpreting it symbolically opens other doors. It becomes a caution about repeating ancient mistakes, extractive approaches to power, technologies divorced from ethical oversight, and the cult of dominion over nature. Whether taken literally or metaphorically, the Atlantean motif in Cayce's readings functions as a warning. Ancient knowledge can heal if used with humility and service. It becomes destructive if used for ego, power, or greed. At this point, a reasonable question is, what does all this mean for an individual watching from a city high-rise, a suburb, a farm, or a remote town? The first imperative is clarity over fear. Cayce's model rewards clarity of mind and intention. If you are alerted by the patterns described here, the most effective steps are communal and psychological. Strengthen local networks, develop shared plans for communication, learn practical skills that support your neighbors, and cultivate emotional steadiness. Do not interpret Cayce as telling you to sell everything and flee. That is exactly the kind of reactive behavior he warned against. Instead, consider measured adjustments that increase resilience, diversify food sources, maintain simple emergency tools, sustain relationships, and invest in your own mental and spiritual life. All of these actions align with Cayce's ethos, without sliding into panic. We should also speak briefly about timing, because the title we began with names 2026 as a focal year. Cayce's readings were not a modern calendar. They were visions expressed in symbolic and sometimes elliptical language. That said, multiple interpreters of Cayce's work have read his material as pointing to a period around our current decade as one of transformation, a time when converging forces could create tipping points. When we say Cayce predicted 2026, we mean that his archive contains content which, interpreted through his three principles, highlights a set of probabilities that converge in and around this time frame. This is not to assert a singular overnight event in 2026. It is to suggest that Cayce's framework points to an intensifying phase where several of these probabilities might crystallize into visible changes. Keep the distinction in mind: intensification and convergence, not deterministic apocalypse. There are, of course, caveats and critiques to consider. Cayce's readings mix medical, spiritual, and geopolitical content in ways that can be internally inconsistent. Interpretations often reflect the biases of those reading them. Those predisposed to apocalyptic frameworks may find more catastrophe, while others focused on spiritual renewal highlight rebirth. Additionally, scientific models of tectonics, climate dynamics, and sea level change are complex, quantitative, and peer-reviewed in ways prophetic texts are not. When we overlay Cayce on scientific concerns, we must avoid substituting one for the other. Treat Cayce as an interpretive supplement, a voice that asks ethical, spiritual, and precautionary questions rather than a replacement for geoscience. Scientists debate models. Cayce provides a metaphysical narrative that can inspire constructive action and moral reckoning. Imagine a neighborhood responding to this map not with fear, but with foresight. They meet, map local assets, decide who has skills that could be useful, build informal communication chains, and design plans to help elderly neighbors and families with small children. They create a small community garden to increase local food resilience. They practice decision-making under stress. Over time, their frequency shifts, anxiety decreases, cooperation increases, and their neighborhood becomes an attractor of support. Cayce would call this alignment. The mind as builder manifesting in the physical world. This is the practical heart of his counsel. Now, what about those dramatic images that circulate online? Maps with coastlines slashed away, dramatic before and after renderings of cities submerged or continents rearranged. These make for viral thumbnails and strong horror story hooks, but they risk reducing Cayce's layered metaphysics to clickbait. Use those images as prompts for sober planning rather than scripts for panic. Treat the map of probability as a tool for imagination. What could happen, and therefore what would it be wise to prepare for emotionally and communally? If Cayce's archive teaches one thing consistently, it is that transformation carries an invitation. Destruction and renewal are part of the same cycle. Communities that say yes to renewal through service, compassion, and wise stewardship are better positioned to catch the possibilities that arise after disruption. Before we move toward a close, one more caution. Do not conflate Cayce's New Age vocabulary with established religious doctrine or with scientific certainty. Terms like Akashic records or Atlantean souls describe a metaphysical architecture specific to Cayce and to certain esoteric traditions. They operate as metaphors for causation, memory, and archetypal patterns. If those words resonate, they can be meaningful tools for interpretation. If they don't, you can still use Cayce's practical counsel, strengthen community, cultivate mental resilience, and act with compassion. There is a universal ethic embedded in Cayce's readings that speaks across metaphysical divides. Service over fear, cooperation over isolation, and humility over hubris. We promised earlier to be explicit about two readings often referenced in this conversation. The first, cited in reading 3976-15, is commonly interpreted by Cayce scholars as speaking to significant activity along the Pacific margins, with language suggestive of rupturing or separation. The second, as cited in reading 3976-29, offers imagery that many readers take to signify a transformational role for Russia in coming cycles. We include these references not to claim they are science, but to anchor the map to Cayce's own library of statements. Readers and viewers who wish to go deeper should consult Cayce archives and reputable analyses that contextualize these readings historically and metaphysically. As we approach the end of this episode, remember the emotional posture Cayce calls for: sober vigilance that refuses panic and hopeful action that refuses paralysis. There is power in intentionality. Set your mind to service. Build relationships now that will matter later. Learn local skills, practice clear thinking, and choose compassion as your operating system. These are not glamorous steps, but they are steady ones. And in Cayce's view, steady steps are what transform a dangerous tide into a path of renewal. If this investigation has raised questions, make a small symbolic commitment below. In the comments, type the phrase, "I'm ready for the new earth," if you choose to align with a posture of service, preparation, and hope. We'll collect those comments not as a ritual of exclusion, but as a measure of intent, an invitation to a community that wants to build rather than panic. And if you want to keep following this thread, we'll go deeper next episode. We'll follow the breadcrumbs to Egypt, the Giza Plateau, the Sphinx, and the small but persistent anomalies that some researchers claim point to forbidden records and archaeological puzzles. There's a reason Cayce's archive and the legends of Giza are woven together in many New Age circles. The connection is complex, intriguing, and worth careful, evidence-oriented examination. In closing, Cayce offers us a map rendered in a language of symbols and probabilities. He points to a world where the planet acts, where collective choices have measurable consequences, and where ancient patterns can re-emerge with new force. Whether you accept his metaphysics or prefer secular science, the overlapping lesson is clear. The coming period calls for clearer thinking, stronger communities, and choices made in service of the greater good. That is the key Cayce lays before us. It is not mystical escapism, nor a call to hide. It is an invitation to wake up, to align the mind and spirit with compassionate action, and to build a life that can weather change with dignity. If you want to continue this investigation, subscribe and hit the bell to join us for the next episode, where we examine Giza, the Sphinx, and the archaeological hints that some say could unlock forbidden records connected to Cayce's visions. And don't forget to leave your comment with the phrase, "I'm ready for the new Earth." May clarity guide your choices, and may service be your path. God bless you.